be $35 the price. We are now going to cross to a live civil defence.
So the impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle are now being seen with heavy rain and severe wind impacting the upper North Island. Overnight we've seen reports of trees going down, roads being damaged and power outages. MetService has advised me that today is the critical day in the event, with a highly dangerous combination of high winds and heavy rain. So the message is, please take care and follow the advice of emergency services. Please keep up to date with MetService for weather warnings and your local Civil Defence Emergency Management Group for local updates and advice. Here in the National Crisis Centre, we are monitoring the overall situation and assessing every 4 hours whether we need to declare a national state of emergency. We have not reached that point and we may not have to. This is an all-of-government response with all agencies ready to respond as needed. Fire and Emergency New Zealand has all units in the northern part of the country at a heightened state of readiness. Waka Kotahi has units ready to keep roads as clear as possible. The Defence Force has deployed 150 people to key areas and have a number of unimogs available to assist with any evacuations, and other agencies stand ready to support. A state of emergency has been declared in Northland, Auckland, Thames-Coromandel, and this morning, Ōpōtiki and Tairāwhiti. This has been a really tough month for many communities around Aotearoa New Zealand. The government is behind you and we are committed to supporting you all the way through this response and the clean-up and recovery that will follow. I want to acknowledge the work of everyone who's been involved in this response: local councils, civil defence staff, volunteers, iwi and community groups who have really stepped up. I also want to thank everyone for listening to the official advice and for getting prepared and supporting each other. Please make sure that when you are getting prepared and stocking up on supplies, to only buy what you need, 3 days worth. And I'd like now to hand over to Roger Ball, the Acting Director of Emergency Management, for an operational update, and then we'll be happy to take questions.
Kia ora, thank you, Minister. Roger Ball from NEMA. As you have heard, this is an unprecedented and dangerous weather event. Please stay safe, don't take any chances. We are expecting very high winds and heavy rain today. At 1 o'clock this morning, the centre of Cyclone Gabrielle lay approximately 230 kilometres nor-northeast of Cape Reinga. The system is still expected to temporarily recurve towards the southwest to lie near Aotea, Great Barrier Island at midnight tonight. Can I emphasise that if you find the winds dropping this evening, this does not mean that you are through the worst of the conditions. The winds will increase again and come from the opposite direction, so you need to be ready to protect yourself and your family throughout tomorrow. Make sure you've prepared your whare for high winds and heavy rain. In affected areas, please avoid all non-essential travel. Stay home, and if you can, and if it is safe to do so. There are several road closures and slips in many areas and fallen trees. If you do have to travel, drive to the conditions and watch for flooding and debris on the road. Please remember, never drive through floodwater. Overnight, Northland experienced winds of up to 140 kilometres per hour. The Hauraki Gulf experienced winds of up to 135 kilometres per hour, and the maximum wind speeds at the Auckland Harbour Bridge were 110 kilometres per hour. Whangarei and Kaikohe received 70 mils of rain over 12 hours. There was no significant rainfall in Auckland last night. Overnight, the western Coromandel Peninsula was buffeted by winds of up to 160 kilometres per hour. Wind speeds for other parts of the peninsula were up to 110 k's per hour. Here in the National Coordination Centre, we are monitoring the needs of civil defence groups around the country to ensure they have the support they need. In Auckland, 24 civil defence centres and shelter sites were opened overnight, along with 3 mass evacuation centres. There are also civil defence centres and community-led centres opening in many affected areas. Please check with your local civil defence for details on these. There has been significant disruption to public transport, with aircraft, ferries, buses and trains either suspended or operating on a reduced schedule. At this stage, we understand we have about 58,000 people across the top of the North Island without power. We are working closely with the relevant companies to understand how quickly that can be restored, but the indications from those power companies are that it may take some days in some cases. If power will be out for a number of days, civil defence in those areas will determine what support the community needs. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
What criteria would force a national state of emergency? What are you looking at?
Well, the key thing is, first and foremost, is are the local civil defence agencies able to respond to their local needs? These things remain locally led, and we would take advice from them as to how they're coping. NEMA are updating us every 4 hours, and so far all of those updates said that they believe it is not warranted. We've got to keep in mind that there's only been 2 national states of emergency so far in our history, one being the Christchurch earthquake, the other being COVID-19. We have a really strong civil defence structure in this country. Its strength is that it's locally led, so we'll be taking advice from them as to how they're going. But it's also important to note that we don't need a national declaration to assist them. For example, Ōpōtiki have had the assistance of the Defence Force for the last few days. When they declared this morning, they were able to act on those evacuations with the help of the Defence Force. They didn't need to wait for that declaration to do so.
So what would be the benefit of a national state of emergency?
Well, what it means is that NEMA would be able to, in some instances, take control of and intervene in certain aspects of it. That would be appropriate if a certain region simply, even with NEMA's support now, couldn't cope with the emergency. That's why it's appropriate, I think, for us and the Prime Minister to get regular updates as to NEMA's assessment of that, and obviously their advice on that would weigh heavily on our decision.
In terms of those power outages, a few days without power sounds pretty upsetting for a lot of people. Is there any way we can get more people in there, or are you expecting more homes to be without power?
Well, the lines agencies have given us an assurance that they will reconnect it as soon as possible, but of course, as long as the weather continues to be as severe as it is, it's actually unsafe for them to do so right now. So we're monitoring that at the moment. It's not just residential places that are impacted by this. Of course, some farmers might have to make some pretty tough decisions around milk and all that sort of stuff. So we're keeping track of that through our agencies, and then NEMA's keeping in close contact with the power and line companies.
Minister, what's the latest on how many people have been displaced? Do we have a figure?
Roger, do you have an update on that?
Look, at this stage, we don't have any kind of precise number on evacuations. To our knowledge, there have been a small number of self-evacuations, but as the situation unfolds, we'll be seeking updates from those CDM groups, and we'll keep you updated.
Do we expect that it's going to be less than what we saw with the flooding that we saw earlier?
I think it's a little bit too early to tell. MetService have said to us that today is going to be the toughest day, and for some areas the worst is definitely not yet over. So I think we need to just let this unfold a little, and more information will emerge as to the impacts. This really hasn't got to the eastern coast of the North Island as yet.
How much more difficult is this cyclone to manage following the floods?
In some respects, there are some advantages, which is that I think it's been well telegraphed. The resources were already activated heavily for what was going on in Auckland, but nonetheless, this is stretching the system quite considerably, and a lot of people are feeling, I think, tired and quite stressed by what's going on, because this is a pattern or a compounding effect across the top of the North Island based on recent events as well.
Of those seeking help at the civil defence centres, what sort of help have they been seeking?
Well, there's a range of things, and obviously every person's individual circumstances are different, but for those that have been unable to find shelter with friends or whānau, but also those that were impacted in Auckland in the first instance, sometimes, and we saw this in Nelson as well, is that they might be able to find an arrangement for about a week, but obviously that was only temporary, and then they come forward. With the second event coming through, that might have brought that decision forward a bit as well. We're not seeing huge numbers at this point. We're also seeing those that might not have permanent accommodation coming forward, because, of course, sleeping rough would be awful in these sort of circumstances. Anybody that needs help should come forward. There's beds, there's mattresses, there's food, and a longer term or medium term accommodation options will be explored and found for them.
Minister, which areas are you most concerned about, and what areas are needing the most support at the moment?
Well, so far the local civil defence, with support of government agencies, are coping incredibly well. But obviously areas like Coromandel, Gisborne and Auckland in particular, but Northland, all of those have been dealing with weather events for a number of months now. As we saw with the event late last year in Nelson, is that when the ground is already saturated, it sometimes doesn't take much rain to cause some issues. And so that's particularly on our mind at the moment. But I've been in touch with pretty much every mayor in an area that is likely to be impacted. They're feeling confident that with government support and the civil defence agencies locally that they've got it in hand. But I've been pretty clear with them. Don't hesitate to get in touch. Tell me what you need and we'll do what we can to help you out.
Minister, you mentioned earlier that people should only be buying what they need. Are we seeing much of a problem yet with panic buying?
There has been some shortages reported, but I was just on the phone to Dr. Duncan Webb, who's in charge of the commerce portfolio. He's been talking to the supermarket chains, both Woolworths and Foodstuffs, and they have assured him that the actual supply chains are actually pretty robust. And what is causing some issues, of course, is that as regions get hit and people have to isolate, that might mean they can't come to work. So we're encouraging people to be mindful of that and only get what they need. And in an event like this, 3 days should be enough. And if you've done your big shop for the week, you might actually already have 3 days worth of water or food on your property already. So please be mindful of that. But also just be mindful that, as with COVID, people that work at supermarkets are doing an essential service and they will be under strain. So a little bit of patience. The supermarkets will get what you need over time.
Coromandel in particular, State Highway 25A, how much more difficult is that going to make things if they get hit pretty hard?
When I went up there last week, we knew it was in a pretty drastic state and it doubled in size overnight. I'd been speaking to the mayor this week and he says it's grown in size again, and that was before the rain came. So there's no doubt that that is a significant disruption for the peninsula. And we'll have to wait and see what the weather event brings. There's huge amounts of rainfall forecast for that. And Coromandel are incredibly well equipped. I couldn't be more impressed with their local civil defence, but they can only deal with what they can as it comes. So that was another thing that we discussed in terms of supermarkets. But Foodstuffs in particular are developing a plan to try and make sure that they get the essentials through to those Coromandel communities, which I was impressed with. And I think it's that sort of proactive nature that everyone pulls their weight. I think that we're going to help make a big deal towards the end of the event.
Just on those power outages, so was it 58,000 people?
Correct.
Yeah, right. People versus households?
People,
right. And so are we expecting that kind of number with the scale of impact that we've had, or have you or the Minister, have you guys been notified of any particular failures within the network?
I think it's a little bit too early to get sort of perspective on it, but what we know is that the power companies are reporting really significant outages as a result of basically high winds, trees coming down on power lines and that sort of thing. And those numbers will fluctuate. I would imagine they'll get some, properties back on quite quickly, but others, as the Minister has indicated, will need to wait until the storm actually gets through. And the companies are already indicating publicly that it could be some days for those people. So they do need to be prepared to look after themselves and activate their family plan.
This might be early days again, but are you noticing any difference in people's behaviour, having perhaps any lessons you might be seeing that people have learned from the flooding that we saw in particular in Auckland?
Well, from what I've seen, people have heeded the warnings, which I'm really grateful for, because it does make all the difference. But we do recognise that for various reasons, some people might not have been in a position to get 3 days worth of supplies, and that's why we're encouraging them to keep in contact with their local civil defence, because if they aren't in a position to stay at home for whatever reason, there will be alternative provisions available to them.
And just on the power, on the power outages, what about those people who can't wait, who depend on power for life-saving services? What is your advice to them, and what's being done to get them online as quickly as possible?
So in the lead up to this, we were encouraging people in that circumstance to get in touch with their provider to make sure that they are aware of that. If, despite being aware of that information, they are now unable to access power, we would encourage them to take steps that would provide their own safety and health first. So if they are reliant on power to ensure their health, then they should be contacting their local health provider and looking at alternatives. But if it's simply a case of that if they are able to do what they need to do in another place, then contacting Civil Defence, seeing if there is a place nearby where they can get alternative accommodation, or looking at friends and family. Conscious that we are also encouraging people not to take unnecessary travel. I don't want to mix the messages. First and foremost, health and safety is the primary focus, and they should do what they can to ensure that they get what they need.
Should they, so just to go back, who should they be contacting in that first instance if they find themselves without power and weren't expecting that?
If it's an emergency, 111 is always the first port of call. If it's a health issue that isn't an emergency, they should be contacting the local health providers. If it's simply a case of that they find themselves without power for whatever reason, they haven't had a chance to get supplies, then they should be looking at the regular communications to come out of their local civil defence to see where the alternative is available if they can't find something with friends and family. I do have to say that we sought assurances before this came that local civil defence, government agencies, local councils, etc. would be keeping communications regular and clear, and for what I've seen, they've kept up with that, and I think it's making a big difference.
How would you compare the communication this time around to the Auckland place?
I think it's pretty clear that comms could have been better in the first instance of the Auckland floods. That's why ministers sought reassurances, and so far I haven't seen any issues that cause concern. I just hope that those regular, clear communications continue. In a situation like this, people need to know what's happening, what's available to them, and what they should do if things turn bad.
Minister, can you talk us through the plan for the next 24 hours for those regions that are in a state of emergency?
Well, I'll pass that on to Roger for technical stuff, but in general, we'll continue to keep in touch with local civil defence and making sure that government agencies are aware of the need and are providing it where they can. And it's NEMA's job to coordinate that. In situations like this, even if it was just one region, but obviously it's many here, the locally led response continues. Government, through NEMA and other agencies, gets in behind it and fills the gaps where they can.
Defence Force personnel, sorry, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that answers it, but thank you.
Defence Force personnel, where exactly have they been deployed?
So they are in other regions, not just in Auckland. So there's been deployments in Northland. They are obviously in Auckland and have been helping the city prepare for this event as well. I mentioned earlier that they have also been in places like Ōpōtiki ready to go to help with evacuations. I'm sure they're in other regions, and I can get the specifics to you. But essentially, because we're in a situation where we got plenty of warning that this was going to come, and that there were already local states of emergency declared in many areas, we were able to get those resources into those regions ready to go to help.
Minister, how comfortable and sort of confident do you feel at this point with all the preparations?
Oh, look, I think that when MetService are warning that this is probably going to be the worst day of the event, that it could be unprecedented, you're always on edge. But what does give me confidence is that, one, people seem to have heeded the warnings and have got prepared, and two, from what I've seen, particularly here in the coordination centre, you've got some incredibly dedicated people that are giving their all to try and help those local responses. This centre's been set up for 16 days or 17 days now on the trot, and some people have been here every single day. That gives us a lot of confidence that where possible, support is being provided. Roger, do you have anything to add to that over the next 24 hours?
Oh, look, I think, we're not through the worst of it yet. And in terms of how this will play out, it's, as the Minister says, there is significant national support and coordination going in, but the response to this will be local and regional, and as we get through it, our minds will start turning to that transition to recovery, but we're a long way from that yet, and we've got to just, in the meantime, make sure that we're providing the regions what they need in order to keep their community safe.
Have we had any hospitals or other critical services impacted by the power outages, or say any evacuation centres hit by flooding like we saw last time?
I haven't seen reports of that, have you?
Not of health facilities, but we're aware of a number of cell phone sites that have been taken down. But our assessment at the moment is that the 111 system is still robust and providing coverage in all areas.
Just one quick safety message. During the floods, we saw a lot of people out in the flood waters. Is that advised?
No, please don't go out in flood water. Don't go out in the high swells. We're seeing reports or projections that some of the swells around coastal New Zealand are going to be absolutely massive. Look, I'm conscious that some people might find that appealing and they might want to go surfing or whatever. If we think back to the messages in COVID, please don't do something that if you get caught will drag emergency responders away from the core task. And that's what we'd echo again today, is that if you put yourself at risk, you could be dragging away key resources from those who need it. But I would just say to those where the weather hasn't hit, but it's projected to, please use the time that you've got to get prepared. As we've seen in those areas where it is now being hit, using this time wisely to get prepared can make all the difference. Thanks very much.
The cell phone towers being out, obviously if the power's out in an area where the cell phone coverage is out, it makes people quite isolated. So what's the government doing to make sure that those people are informed and safe? Well,
for example, if you take Northland, there was the government recently, just this year, put money into and maintain an AM frequency tower up there. Obviously, all technology is moving away from AM, but we recognise for many communities that's actually the only frequency they can get. And the power went out, and they were able to access AM frequency to get the updates they needed. So it's those sort of things, and taking a much broader understanding of what civil defence actually means in an emergency, and the various ways that people can access information, I think is important moving forward. So I'm really pleased that that proved to be the right call. But obviously for those that, just you're talking about mobiles, another key tip is that if your power does get restored, it might not stay on. So use the time once power is restored to charge up your phones and do all those sorts of things, so that if it does go off again, you actually still have access to those things. Cheers. Thanks for that.
Thank you.